Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us a very special guest, Professor Nicolai and Petro. Professor Petro is a professor of politics. He teaches comparative and international politics at the University of Rhode Island. His regional area of expertise are Russia and Ukraine. His latest book is The Tragedy of Ukraine: What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution. Professor Petro, welcome to India and Global Left.
Nice to be with you.
We want to discuss what's going on in Ukraine with you. And I think as a starting point, with all conflicts, we find this dilemma of where to start, whether we start with February 2022, whether we start with 1991, whether we go back to the Bolshevik Revolution, or as President Putin has recently done with Tucker Carlson, we go 1200 years before to understand what's going on. What would you say would be a reasonable starting point to understand what's going on in Ukraine?
Cain and Abel from the Bible, the book of Genesis. Well, there's a section in my book where I talk about the mythology of this conflict. And I point out that these two nations, which are so close that throughout history they have had difficulty distinguishing themselves from each other and have often referred to each other as fraternal. Nevertheless, brothers don't always have loving relations. Sometimes they can't stand each other and want to kill each other. And this too is part of mythology that goes back through centuries. And I highlight the similarities in the relationship between Kiev and Moscow to Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Romulus and Remus, these foundational stories in which one brother got his inheritance at the expense of the other brother and set up a rivalry that was never extinguished, or rather couldn't be extinguished until forgiveness entered the picture and compassion. Then perhaps we can move to a different level of this conflict. But again, it's an old story, and in the mind of Ukrainian nationalists, the deeper injustice of the relationship of Russia to Ukraine is that it should have been Kiev that is the global power, not Moscow. That was the way history should have played out.
When did this thinking emerge?
Well, it became, I think, a core part of the Ukrainian nationalist myth by the early 20th century. In other words, people like Dmitry Dontsov, Siborsky, and a lot of other authors who wrote about why the Russia-Ukrainian relationship needs to be resolved by the extermination of one, of the wrong one, the wrong brother. And in this case, for the Ukrainian nationalists, they quite literally embraced a perpetual war with Russia, precisely as a means for uniting the Ukrainian nation, giving it a drive for existence, for its own existence, a reason for being. And that reason for being became the recapture of the lost inheritance that had been taken from Ukraine when Moscow began to gather Russia's lands and later on basically conquered, incorporated or conquered what by the 17th century was beginning to be referred to as Ukraine, the region at the border. Although the term itself, Ukraine, as I think Putin mentioned, but historians generally know this, is a Polish term for the border regions. From Russia's perspective, the territory of Ukraine is Little Russia, which means exactly what it meant in Greek and in English history, the Little Englanders. The Little Englanders were those who referred to the heartland of England as the real England. So in the same way, Russian imperial historians looked at the separation that had occurred between the southern part of Russian culture and the northern part of Russian culture as something that needed to be reconstituted as one whole, and the heartland of Russian history, of Russian culture, is of course Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, as the 10th century chronicler Nestor from the Kievan monastery of the caves famously put it. This is a phrase that every Russian knows and growing up in history. As a matter of fact, I still have a T-shirt from 2008 when I visited Kiev, where this with this slogan on it: "Kiev is the mother of Russia, mother of the cities of Rus," I should say. And perhaps we shouldn't confuse Rus with Russia. Rus is the prototypical term for the term for the prototypical state of Ukraine, what is today Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus.
Was it a linguistic concept or a territorial concept when we are talking about
Modern
Ukrainian?
Ukraine? Yeah. Well, at some point, these three all come into play. But what traditional historians, and I'm going to distinguish between traditional historians and modern nationalist historians. By modern national historians, Ukrainian historians, I mean people writing just before and starting with Khrushchevsky, the great Ukrainian historian in Kiev, who was also a political leader for independent Ukraine and a member of the first independent Ukrainian government. So over time, thanks to the influence of Poland on, if you look at a map, Western Ukraine, the part west of the Dnieper River, which basically divides Ukraine between east and west, that western portion was under Polish rule, and subsequently, when Poland was partitioned between the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, these regions were absorbed into Austro-Hungary. And so that influence, thanks to the support of that government, of those governments, I should say, encouraged a separation of identity among the local population, which defined themselves as Rusin. And to this day, there are people who call themselves Rusin. Rusin means sons of Rus. And the Slavs in those territories prior to World War I were typically Russophile, because what they were doing was trying to establish their own national identity within the borders of a multinational empire, as Austro-Hungary was, or against the influence of the Polish government, who were trying to Polonize and Catholicize them. So their resistance involved essentially appealing to an older Russian identity. But when that flipped, and after World War II, just on the eve of World War II, those regions were absorbed into the Soviet Union, then the primary enemy of Ukrainian independence became Soviet identity, or, if you will, Russian identity.
Yeah, I want to stop you a little bit here because just to consolidate what we are seeing, what you are saying basically is that starting from maybe 18th century through 19th and early 20th century, we see emergence of nationalism from within the contradictions of empire. And so I want to understand also what happened after 1917, because it is said that the formation of the Soviet Union kind of resolve some of the contradictions of nationalism. There were autonomies that were granted, and yet there was a very checkered history. And a lot of people believe that the disintegration of the Soviet Union eventually uh, brought to the front some of the contradictions of nationalism that already remain. So if you could tell a little bit about what happened after the Soviet Union and prior to its collapse in 1991.
Well, we're talking about developments, the development of the USSR occurring in the context of a hostile West, and eventually in the aftermath of a very bloody fight, which was the First World War, and then the unresolved tensions of that First World War spawned the seeds for the Second World War, with hostility between the new Soviet state and the West and Western empires persisting throughout. After World War I, before World War II, after World War II, all the way up to 1991. The Soviet ideal, the communist ideal, is the creation of a classless state or classless society, put it that way, in which issues of national identity basically receded to the background and common human interests would be the things that drove political interaction and interaction among people, which would lead eventually to a more humanitarian form of society. The things that the part of the process that the Soviets hoped to accomplish, but never actually did accomplish, was at least the transition from capitalism to an advanced form of socialism. Had that been accomplished, the next stage would have, of course, been the great leap into communism, which would have resolved the contradictions that still linger, in, as Marx understood it, in a socialist system. It would be a more just system, no doubt about it, than the capitalist system, but socialism had an ongoing, was in Marx's mind, making an ongoing effort to resolve these contradictions. And until they were resolved, we couldn't really think about the ultimate advancement of that human society would make into communism? Well, I think it's fair to say that the ideological battles in the Soviet Union took a back seat to the need to hold the country together. And I think that was true for the early Bolsheviks, and even more true for Stalin, who saw the country through World War II. And after Stalin's death, the situation really did not become much more relaxed, because the Western powers, led by the United States, had already established a policy of containment. And the first aspect of containment was to halt the expansion of the Soviet Union, but the logical consequence of this would be, over time, the internal collapse of the Soviet Union. And so the Western powers were always on the lookout for evidence of that collapse so that they could push the Soviet system over the edge. Eventually, Western foreign policy became more pragmatic itself. And it did so because it no longer believed, Western leaders no longer believed that the Soviet Union would change or transform into anything else. The past had been lost. The Soviet Union was the only Russia they believed that would ever exist. And as a result, when the internal contradictions within Soviet society manifested themselves and were actually encouraged by a young Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, they were totally unprepared for this and didn't know how to respond. So the response was essentially to do nothing, to stand back and let events unfold as they would. On the one hand, that probably saved us from a direct military confrontation with a decaying Soviet Union. On the other hand, it meant that when the Soviet Union collapsed, we had nothing to offer. The West had no idea what was going to come next, because they had no idea about what Russia was. It had been 3 generations, and no one was thinking in terms of, well, let's make Russia part of a larger European society. And the words and concepts that Gorbachev and then later Yeltsin was talking about having Russia be part of NATO, Russia be part of a European common home, none of this, I can say, because I was in the State Department at the time, none of this made any sense to American leaders. Their thinking was rather binary. We won, you lost, therefore you have to accept the handouts that we give, which are designed to make you a subordinate partner. A partner, yes, but Germany is a partner. England is a partner of the United States, but not equals. Clearly, there's a leader and a follower. And Russia might be that sort of follower if it behaved itself for an indefinite period of time. That was essentially the only Western policy available. Now, there were people, including the author of Containment himself, George F. Kennan, Ambassador Jack Matlock, the last US ambassador to the Soviet Union, Stephen Cohen, a noted scholar of Soviet Russia and post-communist Russia, who said this was very short-sighted and that it would be important to look back in Russian history and understand, as Kissinger famously remarked, that no great power retreats forever. even if it's on its back legs, it eventually stops retreating and says, let's move forward again and follow our own path. And that's exactly what we've been seeing in Russia since Putin has been in office since 1999.
I think I wanted to stay with the 91 or early 90s moments a little bit more, because it seems that right after the collapse itself in Ukraine, there emerged this sort of internal conflict between whether to align ourselves with, among the elites, whether to align ourselves with the West or Russia. And it seems that in up until 2014, the pro-Russian side prevailed, and in 2014, the pro-Western side replaced them. I don't know if you have seen the recent column in the New York Times, which sort of exposes the Ukrainian intelligence drive right from the beginning to align itself with CIA, which was coupled with the CIA's drive to capture these regions. So, can you tell us a little bit more about how did internal politics contested within Ukraine to align with different powers after 91?
A brief aside on the New York Times article. This didn't happen in the last 10 years. This was a policy pursued by the OSS and its successor, the CIA, starting in the 1950s. And there are books written about this. So this is simply a continuation of the undercover aspect of containment. We should perhaps be asking ourselves, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, whom were we containing? I guess the answer is Russia. And then it becomes, then the question becomes, well, what were we containing when we were containing the Soviet Union? Many people thought, and I thought, we were containing communism, but now it turns out that we were containing something more elemental, the very people of Russia and their aspirations. And whereas containing communism had at least a strategic possibility for victory, because a lot of Russians opposed communism, and eventually their opposition helped to reconstitute a post-communist Russia on a different and more nationalistic and historically based trajectory. But if you're going to say Russia is fundamentally incompatible with our view of the world, well, then the end game is only world war. But there is no other scenario that leads to. Now let me go back to your other question, which is the division within Ukrainian elites. Up until 2004, the Ukrainian elite consensus, and I have to take this from the document that is the social compact that defines it, the Ukrainian Constitution. And before that, the Act of Independence declared in 1991, which establishes the parameters which were then established in the Ukrainian Constitution. So in that constitution, there is no equivocation about Ukraine's foreign policy and its national interest. Ukraine was declared to be a neutral state within which would not be in any alliance, and within which there would be no foreign bases. Period. And everybody was on board with that. There were always constituencies and individual politicians who argued that this is outdated we in fact cannot afford to be neutral, and we must look to the West and eventually strive to be within the EU and NATO. Those are two separate organizations. But nevertheless, in that direction. But no politician espousing that agenda had any national constituency in Ukraine before 2004.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2004, we had the victory after a very hotly contested and scandalous election of Viktor Yushchenko. And Yushchenko created a government in which nationalist ideas were given prominence. The idea of a multicultural Ukraine was set aside, and he personally sought and encouraged an appeal to join NATO. But this seemed very far off, and in the course of his government, he was forced to accept his rival Viktor Yanukovych as a prime minister, and accordingly even signed an agreement, the two of them, the president and the prime minister, being from opposition parties, signed an agreement in which they stipulated that Ukraine would remain neutral and not aspire to NATO membership. Then, as you say, the balance shifted again. Viktor Yanukovych was elected and then removed from power in a coup in early 2014, which unleashed a civil war, an internationalized civil war in which Russia participated, as well as the West, each supporting its own side. And over the course of the 10 years since then, support for Ukrainian membership in the EU and NATO has grown significantly.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know how much, because no referendum has ever been conducted. However, regardless of that, in 2019, as one of his last acts leaving office, the former president, Petro introduced an amendment to the preamble of the Constitution, in which he stipulated that Ukraine's ambition would be from now on, forever, to join NATO. Who knows exactly what that means? The weight of these sorts of documents is not as firm or not as hefty as it might be in other countries. Just to highlight an obvious example, Article 10 of the Constitution stipulates that the use of Russian and the safeguarding of Russian cultural heritage is an obligation of the Ukrainian state, and that, of course, has been thrown out completely, and yet it remains in the Constitution. So it's hard to know what all of this really means. However, the current government is certainly committed to NATO membership as part of its foreign policy agenda.
When would you place the rise of the right wing in Ukraine? Is it fair to take it back to 1991, or do we see the beginning of the Orange Revolution in 2004 as somewhat strengthening of the right wing, and then eventually culminating in 2014, when it became overtly vulgar? What is the starting point of the Ukrainian right wing? And also, does
Uh,
it go hand in hand with liberal politics, transition to liberal democracy in Ukraine? Is the right wing the same as uh, those who vouch for liberal democracy in Ukraine?
Intellectually, the origins of integral nationalism, which is a variant of fascism, not exactly the same because it's a little bit different in each country of Western and Eastern Europe. There are slight differences in the pre-war period. Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia, Ukraine, other countries, the Baltic states, which were independent at the time. But nevertheless, there was a common ideological spectrum in Europe in the 1930s that aspired to improve romantic nationalism, which had led to a popularity which had encouraged the idea of creating a nation out of multinational empires as the way to establish true popular rule or democracy. So, under the auspices of integral nationalism, the desire was to take that rather amorphous romantic notion and give it political substance by enforcing the dominance of the majority over the minority. So, in an integral nationalist society, the priority was to safeguard the nation, its borders, its survival against rival enemy neighbors. And in that context, given that that was the supreme objective of any nation, how could it be best achieved? It could be best achieved by having unity under one party with one leader. And that becomes the model throughout Eastern Europe and Ukraine for for establishing independent states. This model loses the struggle of World War II. And therefore, the Ukrainian nationalists, on the eve of the defeat of Germany, rewrite their constitution and declare themselves to be no longer national socialists and integral nationalists, but rather more democratically oriented nationalists, but still nationalists.
So just
under
to
those
interrupt,
auspices, they establish political organizations in the West. In the West,
just that I'm following you, it's almost an inflection from the kind of national socialism or fascism towards liberal democracy after the defeat.
except that it has little to do with real liberalism.
Right. Yeah.
Liberalism is fundamentally the belief that the individual has certain indigenous rights and the ability, therefore, on the basis of those rights, to stand against the dominance of the state. Whereas traditional nationalism, which, by the way, in this sense, also shares a lot with classical Greek democracy, means the tyranny of the majority.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So there is a fundamental tension between liberalism and classical democracy. Nationalism simply is an overlay onto that, which says, forget about all of that, those values. The supreme value is the survival and flourishing of the nation state. And your obligation is to the nation state, is to the nation state and the party that leads it, and to the leader of that party. It's a personal allegiance that is structured in this way to benefit the state, the survival of the state. So from now on, so from 1945 until about 1990, we have constituencies in the West, emigre organizations, their children, their grandchildren, to some extent, who have been inculcated in the idea that, for the case of Ukraine, but not only Ukraine, other national groupings within the former Soviet Union as well, but that Ukrainian democracy, which is what we want, means separation from the Soviet Union, and the strongest leverage that can be exerted to transform Ukrainians and to have them fight the Soviet system is to rely on nationalism, because democracy is, well, it's an abstract concept. What does that mean? But if you say they're preventing you from going to church, it's your church. They're preventing you from using your language. You see, those are the appeals of nationalism, your history, etc. So that was an easier way into the opposition inside Ukraine. Opposition, which, by the way, had its supporters in the Ukrainian Communist Party. The Ukrainian Communist Party, on the eve of 1991, was the one that organized the secession of the Ukrainian USSR, Ukrainian SSR, and set up its own version of perestroika clubs, and supported openly what was called Ruch, the movement for independence in Ukraine.
Can I stop you for a moment here? I just wanted to understand this to be clear. The Ukrainian Communist Party in 91 organizing the opposition out of the Soviet Union, were they driven by genuine transformation or driven by hopes of genuine transformation towards liberal democracy from what they saw as relatively inflexible, let's say corrupt and so on of a regime, or were they driven by what we are now seeing as a far right, sort of almost fascistic government after 2014? Because I think it's important to understand that.
So no, it was not right-wing or fascist. You'd have to ask each member individually, and there were wings within the Ukrainian left at the time, within Ukraine itself. But the three major ones were national communists, who said they still believed in socialism, but they wanted a Ukrainian socialism, which Ukraine was a rich country. In the context of the Soviet Union, it had become a colonial appendage. Therefore, Ukraine needed to separate, concentrate on building socialism within Ukraine itself, which would be more prosperous than what the rest of the Soviet Union was. The second is reform, a reformist movement, which within the Communist Party, which didn't want to separate from the rest of the Soviet Union because it wasn't as interested in Ukrainian nationalism, but wanted a broader definition of socialism, and believed that if the Ukrainian economy separated from the larger Soviet economy, it would impoverish everyone. And lastly, there were the greedy, those who simply said, this is a chance for me to make money. I am in charge of these factories. I am in charge of these territories. I can privatize them, make a ton of money for myself, and leave the country and cash in my chips in some Western country as a result.
And
So
this happened
all
also
three of
in
those.
Russia, not just in
Mhm.
Ukraine.
This is everywhere. This
Yeah.
is everywhere, but it's a common facet of the nomenclatura elite that existed at the top of the Soviet hierarchy, which, by the way, there was a all-union hierarchy in Moscow, which was replicated by local hierarchies in each of the 16 republics. So when each of these republics declared their independence, they became the local lords, the local feudal chieftains. And for that to transform into something more than that, you needed a lot more local reform as well. And that is also the story of the rise of Ukrainian, some aspects of Ukrainian nationalism is essentially a fight of the regions of Ukraine against the dominance of the old Communist Party hierarchy in Kiev. Some people say, which still is controlling a lot of the assets in Ukraine today, in Kiev, and not allowing localism and local wealth to be distributed from the center to the rest of the country. Now I've forgotten what the other aspect of your question is.
Yeah, I think we were discussing about the rise of the right wing.
So yes, the right wing comes into play, achieves visibility in 2010. 2010, we begin to see, we see for the first time a far-right party, Svoboda, entering the Ukrainian parliament and getting 10% of its seats. How is this possible? It becomes possible because the president at the time, Viktor Yushchenko, supports a more nationalist agenda. He doesn't see a threat on the right. He believes that this is a constituency that is logically his, and therefore will support anything he does. And he's probably right on that count. So he does everything in his one term in office to encourage them to have more visibility, create state institutions that promote alternative histories, nationalist histories, declaring the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which fought alongside Hitler's army to be national liberation fighters for the national liberation of Ukraine. He declares Stepan Bandera and Roman Shulkevich, commanders of the Ukrainian insurgent army, to be national heroes of Ukraine. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. He sets processes in motion throughout the government establishment to essentially shift from the previous traditional pro-Soviet philo-Russian interpretation of history to one that basically rejects the Soviet history, rejects Russian history, and projects Ukraine in a totally different historical, as having always existed in a completely different historical context. And that then leads us up to his defeat in 2012 at the hands of Viktor Yanukovych, who is not, I think, correctly labeled a pro-Russian. He is not pro-Russian. He is pro-Eastern Ukrainian. He is, in other words, his political constituency is in Eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine is culturally, historically more Russophile than Western Ukraine. So he's relying on his base, and his base supports him. And that is why when the tensions erupt in the Maidan that lead to his overthrow, this is seen throughout Eastern and Southern Ukraine as another coup. The first one being the 2004 loss of Yanukovych to Yushchenko, which was organized by running a uh, third election, a third round of the election, which there's no provision for this on the Constitution, but essentially the West wanted to make sure that the pro-Western candidate won that time. However, in the elections of 2012, that pro-Western candidate lost decisively, and Yanukovych took power, which was an outcome that by that time the far right, having a formal presence in the parliament, and as well having an extra parliamentary presence in civil society through a vast network of organizations, part of them civic and part of them paramilitary, began to create an organized resistance to the government that used the Euromaidan of the end of 2013 and hijacked it in early 2014, militarized it, and then accomplished the coup in 2014, which swept away the negotiated transition of power that had been negotiated February 20th between the organized opposition, on the one hand, the political parties, and Yanukovych's government. That organized negotiated transition, negotiated by the prime ministers of, I should say, the foreign ministers of France, Germany, and Poland, with a Russian representative there as well, would have allowed for a continuation of Yanukovych in power under a weaker constitution for 6 months, then new elections, which presumably the Maidan candidates would have won. However, that was rejected by the far right, which had control of the streets and therefore invaded the parliament, took over the parliament, removed Yanukovych in a vote which had no validity because there was no quorum and there's no procedure for the removal of the president under the Constitution. And as a result, they simply declared themselves to be both the parliament and the executive branch. And that, of course, spawned the original military conflict, I should say, at secession in Crimea, and roughly a month later in Donbas. The different outcomes there, I explain all this in my book, by the way. If anybody wants to read about the detailed history, they can get it there. But what happened was that in Crimea, because of the local composition of the populace, and because most of the Ukrainian forces, armed forces that were there, were locally garrisoned. They were kids from that region. They refused to fight. They refused to fight.
They were Russian speaking?
Everyone in Ukraine is Russian speaking at that time, but certainly in Crimea, overwhelmingly so. And as a result, they simply refused to fight. And 80% went over not to the Russian forces at the time, but to the independent Crimea, the independent government of Crimea, which had declared itself separate from Ukraine. And then subsequently, after the referendum, which was held, they requested admission to Russia. So all of this sort of, went very peacefully. And in Donbas, the same process was underway. And they were hoping for the same result. But Putin did a very strange thing in Donbas. He said, I don't want Donbas to leave Ukraine. I want it to remain in Ukraine, and I therefore do not support the referendum there. And instead, I will recognize the legitimacy of Petro Poroshenko, who was elected president. And that changed the entire dynamics in the Donbas, because I suspect no one expected the fight in Donbas to continue that long. There was a back and forth. Then the Ukrainian army suffered two major defeats. Putin then proposed the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords were a means of Ukraine regaining the territory of Donbas, reestablishing its borders where they had been since 1991, but with the caveat that there should be some local self-government in the Eastern Territory. The premise, the three things that they demanded in the Eastern Territories to rejoin Ukraine was some say in the appointment of the local governor, because all governors in Ukraine are not elected, they're appointed by Kiev. Secondly, some degree of say in who heads the local police, again, which is a national appointment, not a local appointment. So some say in that. And thirdly, the right to use Russian officially locally in the region where 95% of people speak Russian as their native tongue. These were not acceptable terms to Ukraine, so they continued the fight for 8 years. And what we know happened in February, the end of in 2021, was that all Ukrainian officials essentially officially withdrew from the Minsk process, said we don't see it as having any validity anymore, and then made declarations to the effect that in 2021 at the Munich Security Conference, Zelensky said we should reconsider Ukraine's position as a non-nuclear state. That's all he said. That was certainly a hint aimed at Russia. And lastly, over the course of 2021, the British government and the Ukrainian government negotiated the construction of a Ukrainian a military base, which I guess would be under some sort of joint jurisdiction or involvement with the British Navy on the Black Sea. And as a result, Putin proposed a moratorium on expansion of NATO and some sort of formal agreement that NATO would not expand further and would not place weapons on Russia's border within Ukraine. And lastly, some sort of guarantees for the rights of the people in Donbas who had been fighting for 8 years for autonomy. And when that was rejected, as we know, and when all those demands were rejected, Putin invaded Ukraine and now seeks to impose essentially those same conditions on the West through his conquering of Ukrainian territory.
I want to ask you a little bit about how you see this going forward. But before that, if I can ask you to tell us a little bit more about the cultural, the linguistic, religious, and how they are distributed regionally within Ukraine. So that one of the things that strikes me is I recently reread like Samuel Huntington's essay written in 1991 or 92, and the interesting thing was he said that Ukraine and Russia would never go into conflict. And his thesis was that because they are somewhat homogenous as a population, and yet that didn't happen. That also explains some of his major weaknesses. I wanted to ask you this also because what we are seeing almost globally is communities that for a very long time seemed like being able to coexist, even though with various tensions. I'm thinking about Hindus and Muslims in India. I'm also thinking about the blow up in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the of Yugoslavia and communism in Eastern Europe. Ukraine was a place that sort of gave an impression that different communities could live together, and yet eventually it blew up. Can you tell us a little bit about these internal cultural dynamics?
Cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, diverse national identities are not per se the problem anywhere. And they certainly are not in the case of Ukraine. What makes them a problem is when they become the political litmus test for loyalty to the state. And that is the defining quality of nationalism, which is why I define nationalism as the last, perhaps respectable, perhaps not, form, but nevertheless the last form of totalitarianism. Remember, a nationalist defines the interests of the nation above all other interests. You may have your language interest, you may have your this interest, your that interest, your religious interest. None of that should matter more than your total loyalty to the state. That's quintessentially the definition of nationalism. So you can take an entirely normal, healthy people and turn them into crazed fanatics that way. You use the media to do so, and you can see all sorts of crazy subcultures on the internet. Thank God they don't all have their own countries, and armies is all I can say. But I think the formula there is rather predictable. Huntington is not wrong because he has said, like all great thinkers, he has said things that contradict each other over time. So on the one hand, it is difficult to imagine Russians and Ukrainians, or for that matter, in Belgium, the Flemish and the Walloons, or in Yugoslavia, through much of its history, who could imagine Serbs and Croats being at each other's throats? But he said at the same time, or maybe within a few years of that, another famous phrase with respect to Ukraine. He said it is a cleft society. And there are different ways to look at this Russia-Ukraine conflict. Certainly one that some Ukrainian analysts, now in opposition to the government, but formerly within the government, like Alexei Arestovich, and also consistently, I think, Vladimir Putin has argued that this is a civil war. I think what they mean by this, what they're thinking of, is a civil war within Ukrainian society. But that's too narrow. It is actually a civil war within all of Eastern Slavia, because there are people trying to identify which vision of their relationship is correct on both sides of this border, and in Belarus as well. Not to mention these same communities, numbering in the millions, in countries like Kazakhstan and throughout the Baltic states. There are Russians and Ukrainians there. And in Western Europe, I mean, these communities exist everywhere. And they go to the same churches very often. And they often speak the same language to each other, and their children play together throughout the world. And yet, the same heart-rending question arises. Why are we fighting? How did we get here? And it's not at all helpful in resolving this conflict to stipulate that it is one government versus another government. It is a much, much deeper debate, and perhaps even wound that needs to be healed.
But wouldn't you say, while structurally speaking, these divisions are much deeper, wouldn't you say the nature of one government actually ultimately blows it up? I mean, this is something which is very consistent across the board.
So governments are the ones who say, go to war. Now we are at war. I mean, obviously. But they have to appeal to their constituencies with a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that these different narratives, the Ukrainian narrative, we are fighting for independence against a political system that we do not want to be part of, and a culture, the Russian world, that we do not want to be part of, resonates with people who are not necessarily Ukrainian. Some of them are Russian in Ukraine or in Russia or in Kazakhstan or wherever they fled to from Russia. Again, we're talking about, I think, close to 1 million people who left neighboring countries just because they were opposed to the war, which means the war narrative, with the justification for the war. And on the other side as well, we have the Russian narrative, which is we were forced into this by essentially an illegitimate government, which is situating itself as the anti-Russia and seeks to destroy us eventually with the assistance of the West. They're not interested in dialogue with us, and they are suppressing the fundamental rights of their own people. And there are people in Ukraine and as well as Russia and throughout, again, all of the world where these people are, who say, yeah, that makes sense to me. That's the narrative that I buy into. And what I highlight in my book is that fundamentally, this is not a dialogue. It's an assertion of mutual fears. If I give you an inch, you'll take everything from me. And both sides believe that. Well, both governments believe. Who knows what the people believe? And it becomes much more complicated at the lower level. And that, which is why you see the uncompromising rhetoric, which of course which is pointless. I mean, eventually, to anticipate your next question, how is this going to end? Mm-hmm. This conflict will end the way every single conflict in human history has ended, which is with an acknowledgement of defeat by one side. And we will get to that point once both sides agree that the situation on the battlefield is settled. It's not going to change. It's this way. And both sides have to look at this and say, yeah, that's the way it is. I agree with you that that's the way it is. Once that emotional militaristic component of the conflict is overcome, the table is cleared for negotiation. Then, because there is something to negotiate, where will we draw the dividing line? That's basically a technical matter. For diplomats, people who are not obsessed with emotions, and they say, okay, how about here? No, how about there? It's just a matter of putting a line on the map. And then after that, and all of that, the process being normally withdrawal of forces, ceasefire, armistice, negotiations, settlement. None of that is peace. None of that is peace. That simply means that we have now moved on from shooting at each other to fighting each other mentally, which, of course, the people who used to be shooting at each other a month ago and are now stuck with a peace settlement haven't changed their minds. They simply are no longer allowed legally to shoot at each other. And at that point, the hard task, which is a task for at least a generation, if not more, is to find reconciliation, to find a way to understand the pain of your enemy and see yourself as your own enemy, and to think, well, what did I personally do to lead to this great tragedy? And that's the great benefit of classical Greek tragedy, is that it forced the Athenians and the Spartans during the 20 years of Peloponnesian War to that realization that we are actually much more like each other and should stop killing each other, because we are Greeks first and foremost. We are human beings. Well, essentially what the Greeks thought that meant we're human beings. They didn't recognize humans as anyone else as human beings, but they were the human beings. And therefore, what are we doing here? And the whole there's an entire process at work here, which involves catharsis, which involves recognition of how you contributed to the tragedy, and therefore are willing to offer forgiveness and literally forget the pain caused by the other. You may not be able to do that in your lifetime. That may be the task for your children, who have a harder time, who will not literally remember the pain as you do. And that gives them the opportunity to move beyond it.
I'm so glad you spoke about the deeper levels at which resolutions are needed, which eventually should be at the level of communities and not just an agreement at the level of governments. If I could just quickly leave you with this final question about the role of the US, because the resolution to continue war in Kyiv depends significantly on NATO support. If you read the Financial Times, for instance, against its grain, there is a great nervousness about the coming of the Republicans in the US. And yet we know that even Trump, who was not necessarily hawkish against Russia by himself, had appointed national security advisors as John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo and no, Bolton was the national security advisor.
He was national security advisor, but Pompeo was Secretary of State. Sorry.
And Pompeo, both of whom were very hawkish. And the New York Times report also shows us how these intelligence officers expanded massively during the Trump years. So where do you see US and NATO going forward?
I've heard the argument made that Russia needs to negotiate a settlement to the Ukrainian crisis with Washington. I disagree with that strongly, because it's wrong on many levels. One, it denies basic agency and respect to Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government. Secondly, the United States in particular is essential to the survival of the Ukrainian state, but it is not interested in the well-being and interests of Ukraine per se. It is a foreign government. Like all governments, its primary obligation is to its own interests and its own citizens. To the extent that any ally of the United States aligns with America's interests, America will support it. But ultimately, there needs to be a clear and there is a clear understanding, I think, among American allies of the limits of American interests. That is something that Ukrainian political officials, I think, are just now beginning to grasp, that their interests, the interest of the survival of their state, may not be seen in the same way as the interests of the United States government. Excuse me. And as a result, I think the only real solution is for Ukrainian officials and Russian officials to negotiate this settlement between themselves. Once they come to terms, the other powers around them will have no leverage to force them to fight. They essentially will have taken all the cards away from NATO and from the United States and even from China, and said, okay, we have essentially resolved this issue ourselves, and we can now establish our own relation and do it on terms that are mutually beneficial and not beholden to a variety of other interests. Again, to mention a close and a person close to Zelensky and highly placed in the Ukrainian government at the beginning of last year, Alexei Arestovich, counselor to the president of Ukraine, he now argues the same thing. It is the key to peace in Ukraine is peace with Russia. Because if one thinks about it in terms of basic international politics, no country can do well, can thrive by making a larger neighbor its permanent enemy. That has never occurred in history. So the fundamental negotiation and accommodation needs to happen between Ukraine and Russia on a bilateral level. And once that is taken care of, I think that removes many of the problems that have plagued Ukrainian society and arguably Russian society for the better part of 20, 30 years.
I promise you, I'm letting you go with this last one. One of our viewers also asked this. His name is Raghav Singh, our subscribers. He asked, what are the chances of the right wing being overthrown? And I think that's relevant in what you are saying, because one of the things that is said is that the right wing is a great impediment, even for people like Zelensky, who could have been otherwise amenable for negotiation. The right wing would never allow him to. So if you can just tell us, how strong do you think the right wing is, and what are the chances of overthrowing the right wing from within the Ukrainian institutions?
So the right wing is a subtle and invisible power. Its institutional impact is not widely advertised, but it is influential because of the connections that it has and the governmental support and funding that it is providing. However, it doesn't express its power in an organized political party. It doesn't need to. What it does is it sets limits to the kind of policies that the government has pursued. And when necessary, it threatens people who deviate from its vision, from the far right's vision of, of the policy that need to be conducted. Well, for example, shortly after Zelensky's election, when he agreed to the Steinmeier formula of Minsk II, Dmitry Yarosh, the head of the right sector, threatened to hang Zelensky publicly if he didn't rescind. So my argument with respect to the right sector is that, like any domestic terrorist group, it will need to be subordinated to the rule of law in if Ukrainian society is to become modern, a modern democracy. Essentially, you cannot have vigilante groups threatening political officials and organizing paramilitary organizations as they do now, which openly defy the will of the military and the police institutions. That cannot occur under any government, or should not occur under any government. So this is a problem that has existed in Ukraine since at least the 1990s. I mean, it's been a visible problem because these organizations, the paramilitary organizations, have existed at least that long. And now they have grown larger and more influential, and some of their leaders indeed are also leaders within the military with arguably dual allegiance, one to the state military and the other to the paramilitary ideology that they espouse. So there's no way around confronting that. The debate, I suppose, is whether there is enough power, whether the government in Kiev has enough power and authority to do so. This is a very serious dilemma for the current Ukrainian government, but it is one that they cannot avoid facing.
Because they are also their supporters, right? In a way,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Right. It ultimately boils down to what kind of Ukraine are we building? What kind of Ukraine will the future be like? Will it be the nationalist dream of a monolithic, monocultural Ukraine? Or will it be a pluralistic and democratic Ukraine? It can't be both. And the choice of a democratic and pluralistic Ukraine has to be made by the curtailment of organizations, especially military organizations, that seek to overturn that type of government and replace it with an ideologically monolithic dictatorship.
Professor Petro, thank you very much for your very generous time.
Well, thank you.
All right.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.